What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So I'm here to say in the aftermath of UFC 319 that Dricus du Plessis, Aaron Pico, and Kai Asakura do not belong in the UFC. And I can already hear people objecting, especially about the du Plessis example, and saying, what do you mean du Plessis doesn't belong in the UFC? He was just the champion. He wasn't just a champion, but he was a defending champion. He beat divisional greats in his run through the title. He beat Whitaker. He beat Israel Adesanya. He was on an 8 or 9 fight win streak in the UFC. Up until this weekend, he was undefeated in the UFC. What do you mean he doesn't belong here? He might still be the second greatest middleweight in the world right now. What do you mean? And I'm not saying he can't win. I'm not saying he's not good enough to be here. I'm saying he doesn't belong here. And it's the same with Pico. It's the same with Asakura. Like, Pico lost his debut. I could still see him being a top 15 fighter, maybe a top 10 fighter. I don't think he'll ever fight for the title in the UFC, but I don't think he is dog shit. I don't think he's not good enough to be here. Asakura, he might just actually not be good enough to be here. You could give him unranked fighters and he might still lose. We'll see. It's not looking good for him. But in any case, that's not why they don't belong here. It's not a matter of can they beat ranked fighters? Can they maybe win a belt like du Plessis did? The point is that the UFC as it currently exists and the current sporting landscape of MMA is not for these guys. And what I mean by that is these are action fighters. These are guys who come out, they have exciting styles, they're looking for finishes, and they take risks, and they're flawed. These are not people who are optimizing the game, because MMA has developed enough as a sport that it has become a sport. It is a game now. It's not just a fight anymore. And the UFC, in tandem with that, has become a pseudo-monopoly. They effectively have a monopoly on all the top talent in all the divisions, at least the ones that they have. They don't have a men's strawweight division, for example. But in all the divisions under their banner, they have the lion's share of the top 15 people in every division. Some notable exceptions, like Francis Ngannou, who's off in PFL. But broadly speaking, the top people just are in the UFC these days. And the sport has evolved to a point where it is a game now. Where the top people have to use strategies and hone their games in such a way that optimize their chances for success, that minimize the risks they take. And that's just antithetical to being an action fighter in the classic archetype, in the archetype that du Plessis and Pico and Asakura fit into. You just can't be that guy anymore and have a realistic shot of not only becoming a champion, but becoming a reigning champion, becoming, a top pound for pound fighter. Those days are effectively gone. It's not that action fighters can never become a champion anymore. Jerry Prohaska became a champion. But broadly speaking, the odds of that are slim to none. And it's set up now so that people instead, like Kamaru Usman, like Islam Makhachev, like Alexander Volkanovski, like Merab Dvalishvili, people like that are the ones who are going to succeed at the highest level. They're the ones who are going to be the actual top pound for pound fighters, the actual long reigning champions. And none of those guys are boring. All the guys I listed, I think, are still fun to watch. Some more than others, but I think they've all had very fun performances. And several of them are good finishers. They're not just decision machines, but they aren't action fighters. They aren't like Jerry Prohaska. They aren't like Dricus du Plessis. They aren't like Kai Asakura. Now, there's exceptions where, like Charles Oliveira is this beacon of light in this modern era where you have a genuine action fighter who actually became the champ and defended multiple times, but even he had a short-lived run. And even he was sandwiched between Khabib Nurmagomedov and Islam Makhachev. And you can just see that he was never going to be a champion the way those guys were meant to be champions in this modern age. The era of the Wanderlei Silvas is over. Wanderlei Silva, during his peak, probably was the best light heavyweight in the world. And he was a long-time reigning champion in Pride, the top promotion at the time. And he had a long win streak. And he was the guy. I haven't looked at pound for pound lists from back then, but I'd wager he was, I would bet he was a top 5 pound for pound fighter in most people's lists back in the day. That just can't happen anymore. And it's due to a combination of things, like I said. It's due to the UFC monopolizing the top talent. It's due to the sport just evolving into an actual sport. And it's also hurt by the fact that the UFC has the lamest rule set. The UFC operates under the United States' unified rules for MMA. It's in a cage instead of a ring. There's no yellow card system, to punish, boring wrestlers and shit like that. The scoring criteria, they've been making changes, but the scoring criteria is more wrestler friendly, and it always has been. They don't allow for stomps and knees and soccer kicks to the heads of downed opponents. Like, it's the most boring rule set. And most boring, they've got the round system and everything. They don't judge the fight as a whole. All these things, combine to make the most boring rule set that allows for the more boring fighters to win. And again, the sport has evolved into an actual sport, and the UFC has a monopoly on the talent. So the UFC is just not the place for action fighters. They still have some on the roster, and they always have. You've always had your Joe Lazans and your Matt Browns and people like that. They've always had these guys in the UFC, and they still have them, and they're still even hiring them. They're still contracting them to this day. Andreas Gustafsson is like an up-and-coming welterweight who looks like just a pure action fighter. We'll see what he does. He just beat Chaos Williams. But broadly speaking, those kinds of guys are not meant to succeed in the UFC. They might stick around, they might get some good wins, they might pad out the roster, they might fill out cards, but they're not who the UFC is for. Increasingly, is there this divide between what the UFC is doing and what the other promotions are doing? Because if you want more exciting fights, if you just want action fighters, if you want violence, if you want spectacle, you need to watch Ryzen, you need to watch One, you need to watch KSW. That's where that shit happens. And that's where these guys belong, and that's where they came from. That's where Pico belongs, that's where Asakura belongs, that's where Duplessis belongs, that's where this Gustafsson guy belongs. They all belong there. They don't belong in the UFC. Because wouldn't you rather just see these guys have more exciting, more violent fights in cooler promotions with cooler rule sets, with more spectacle, where they fight more often per year? Because typically these guys, when they have careers outside of the UFC, rack up more fights than when they do inside the UFC, typically. Wouldn't you just rather see that? Just like a John Lineker going to One. Even in the twilight of his career, it's been more exciting just watching him do shit over there than it was in his last couple of years in the UFC. And so I just don't need to see Duplessis be in the UFC. I know he wants to be the best in the world. If you watch interviews with him, if you watch interviews with Pico, they speak as though they envision themselves as being a GOAT, as going down as the greatest to ever live, as being the champion, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all well and good. I'm not trying to discourage their dreams. I'm just saying they don't fight like that. They don't fight like guys who are trying to make that happen. They fight like action fighters. And that might just be their personality, and it might just be a clash where their goals and their values conflict with their personality in a way where they don't fight in a way that is optimized to actually achieve their dreams. And, that's just miserable fortune. But in any case, the actual fighters that they are in the ring and the cage, are not fighters who belong in the UFC. They're fighters who belong in regional promotions. And I would like to just kind of slowly see that divide widen, actually. I would like the UFC to shrink its roster, to stop having these fucking padded cards, stop bringing in bums from the Contender Series and stuff like that, and just have the top 20 or 30 people in the world just in there doing their thing for the most part, and then have most of the other people, most of the action fighters, most of the exciting fighters, fighting in regional promotions where the rules are cooler, where they're fighting in a ring, where the spectacle is better. That's what I want to see.